Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
We have a really big story to start off with, and that would be the Russian bounty story collapsing before the media's eyes. We have a supercut that the Daily Caller put together. We're just going to play that for you. Pay attention, really, to just how bad of a job the media did at covering this story.
In our World Lead today, President Trump dismissing the Russian bounty intelligence story as a hoax meant to damage him and Republicans. The president often touts his relationship with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin.
The White House also responding tonight to a bombshell report accusing Russia of offering bounties to the Taliban to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan.
And now you know from this reporting in the New York Times, which has since been confirmed by the Wall Street Journal, that not only does the president know that Russia was paying for American soldiers' deaths.
News. Get this. The Washington Post is now reporting that the alleged Russian bounties to Taliban fighters in Afghanistan are believed to have resulted in the deaths of U.S. troops.
Like this New York Times story about a stunning U.S. intel assessment, finding that Russia secretly offered Afghan militants bounties to kill U.S. troops.
So comes under fire over those bombshell reports that the White House was told Russia was paying bounties to kill U.S. troops in Afghanistan.
The most important application of that question is, what did the president know about Vladimir Putin offering a bounty for the killing of American soldiers in Afghanistan, and when did he know it?
A senior Afghan official confirmed to CBS News that the reports were not only true, but the Russian government achieved some.
Okay, Ben, does it mean anything to confirm something anymore? What's your reaction to this video?
Yeah, of course. This is, again, thin sourcing. And now we find out from our intelligence community that they have very low confidence in what that assessment was. Ultimately, of course, what was this about? It was about grab anything you possibly can to try to undermine President Trump and portray him as a traitor and un-American and siding with our worst adversaries and the like. Meanwhile, of course, on the substance of it, and of course, this would not have ever emerged had there not been a Russiagate fraud in the first place that was foisted on us, because this is supposed to be another data point of, oh, here's the president. He always sides with Vladimir Putin and the Russians, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, if you looked at the substance of the policies, President Trump was infinitely tougher on Russia than his predecessor, the Obama-Biden administration. We don't even need to go into the merits or the substance of it, but this was, as with almost everything else in the coverage of the presidency, it was a narrative in search of any and every data point that could be used to justify it. And of course, we only find out the truth months after the fact, and the retractions. I mean, where's Twitter and where are Facebook now going out and censoring past tweets and Facebook posts about this? Are they going to sanction the New York Times and the Washington Post for writing about this? Is CNN going to face a price for it? Of course not, because at the end of the day, this was all about politics, not about the merits or the substance of the issue. And how many stories were there like this? I mean, every single week, there were multiple stories like this. And of course, in the run-up to, in the throes of an election, when you bring up something like this, it's just like the president bad-mouthing our troops, which was not based in anything whatsoever. It's just more shameful activity. You do have to ask the question, why did this come out now? And of course, why it comes out now is in part because they have to cleanse everything as the Biden administration tries to essentially copy the Trump administration on Afghanistan.
Well, here's a great question that we just put up on the screen. Why aren't these Moron News Network channels held accountable? It's a great question. And the answer is because they own the entire market. Something we talk about a lot on this show that is really the only solution to stopping the flow of misinformation from the corporate legacy media that claims to be sort of like hysterical and obsessive about monitoring and suppressing disinformation. It's actually, the great irony is that they often, more often than they ever will admit, actually convey disinformation through their own shoddy reporting, because the standards at these outlets have just sunk year after year after year, because they all are swimming in the same ideological waters to the point where they are not critical, sufficiently critical of Democrats and of the left and of, let's say, allies of the left, neoconservatives, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the next break, or never Trump conservatives. They don't apply due skepticism to people with whom they are fellow ideological travelers because they lose sight of what is ideology and what is fact. They totally lose sight of that. But the problem is they convey all of it as objective truth. And this is an interesting case where we can see, Ben, here's my question to you. Do you think this story would have been published 15 years ago? And that's not to say the media was ever super fair to Republicans or to the right, but there were different standards. Do you think this would have passed editorial mustard 15 years ago?
Absolutely not, unless it was like the thing that was going to totally sink a presidency, maybe. I mean, there were certain standards that would be upheld, and it was an understanding that, yes, the entire media is essentially biased, and it's monolithic in its progressivism, and it's really pretty much always been the case that it's been that way. But at the very least, there was some pride and integrity in the fact that you are a journalist, truly a journalist, not an activist. Today, the entire shift, and actually Michael Tracy, who looks at this from sort of a left perspective, a left-wing perspective, on his blog on Substack, has written about this, how activist journalism is the entire game today. And what activist journalism means is essentially your opinion writers. And they're opinion writers who happen to have some sources, some who are credible and some who are not credible. But clearly the editorial standards just do not exist. The editorial standard is drive home a political narrative no matter the cost. And because they never pay a price for it, it's going to persist. That's why competition is so critical here, as you noted. But also you have to ask the question, the audiences of these platforms, if they continue to frequent these debunked or should be debunked and discredited platforms, clearly they're catering to an audience, and the audience wants more of it. So they're responding, I guess, in some ways to market forces, although obviously most of the legacy media has paid a huge price for all the dogged work that they did to bring down President Trump. And the only other point that I want to make that I didn't hit before, and I should have, is the fact that, of course, this is, again, the national security / law enforcement / intelligence apparatus that theoretically, at least, was at root. I don't know that we know the names of the sources of the information that was disseminated by the media. But once again, it was the media uncritically accepting what was told to them by sources who have become hyper-politicized and weaponized in many respects, and launder misinformation or disinformation through a media that basically writes it exactly as it's explained to them based upon what we've learned via Russiagate and several of these other case studies as well. And so the other disturbing aspect of this is, of course, the people who are supposed to challenge the adversarially challenge those in power are doing the exact opposite in this case. And when it comes to national security, foreign policy, and intelligence, that represents an even greater shift, I think, than what you were talking about of how 15 years ago there would be some standards in place to prevent these sort of stories from ever seeing the light of day, particularly with respect to law enforcement, intelligence, and national security, which the media used to be hostile towards, going back to Vietnam and probably before Vietnam as well. Now the pendulum has completely shifted. They are all on the same page, which is a danger for America because it means we can't get to the truth. There isn't the scrutiny that ought to be put forth. And it's even worse, of course, when we now know, and I've written about this, as have probably you and several others as well, at the Federalist and beyond, of course, as the national security, law enforcement, intelligence apparatus become woke, it becomes even more dangerous. It actually becomes a threat to our life and limb, and the media now play a role in it and are colluding in those efforts.
Yeah, I was actually just going to say that's what I wanted to talk about is, and I don't think a lot of other media critics talk about this enough, which is the role that wokeness has played in allowing the swamp to perpetuate the swamp. And that's to say that when you create an atmosphere where groupthink is the only acceptable think, you totally lose all alternative perspectives that challenge a dominant narrative. So the Russian collusion hoax is a really good story of this. And this Russian bounty story seems to potentially be an extension of that, which is where you have a group like Fusion GPS of former reporters pitching stories to Democrats and then getting uncritical treatment of those stories that they pitched, laundered great word that you use, it's exactly what happens, into the corporate media and also presented as the objective reality when in fact it's actually an alternate reality. It is not reality. It's this sort of like ideological leftist partisan perspective on what's happening, but it's not always grounded in factual reality. In fact, a lot of times it is not grounded in factual reality. And so the dominance of this atmosphere where it's dangerous for people in the media to criticize the left because then they are supporting the right. And the right is bigoted, they say, and the right is irredeemable. When you have an atmosphere like that, it is an incredibly dangerous situation because literal fake news goes through like this sort of lowered bar, right? Like it gets through this lowered bar and then it's presented as objective reality. And this story seems to be a pretty clear illustration of that process.
And to take it even further to the individual example of who suffers as a consequence of this, because individual examples, as our propagandists in the media know, are far more powerful than talking about numbers and mass. Look at Carter Page's life. Carter Page essentially had his life destroyed, his civil liberties completely ruined as a consequence in large part of reporting that was done via interested intelligence / law enforcement / national security official sources. And then that's used to go into a Steele dossier, which is used to justify getting a FISA tap on him. So that is the ultimate consequence of this, is it can lead to the erosion of our liberties, and it's never going to lead to the erosion of the liberties of the people on the other side, because our side doesn't do this, and we don't control an administrative state, needless to say. But it just goes to show you that individual lives get absolutely wrecked as a consequence of this. There are no consequences to it beyond people being lied to and then not being able to trust anything that the authorities say, which is sort of where we're headed right now. And with the coronavirus and any number of issues as well, you see this. But the consequences of this are massive. And while the media doesn't pay a price for it, of course, the consumers, the ones that prop up the media, do pay a huge price for it.
Well, let's use that to transition into our second topic here, which is the varying coverage, the divergent coverage of two presidents who want to end the war in Afghanistan. Here on the left, we really need to get Drew on the show because his Twitter feed is just a constant chronicling of media hypocrisy, media double standards, and media incompetence. So you see right here on the left coverage of what happened when President Trump on CNN was withdrawing the troops, and then also when President Biden this week announced plans to withdraw the troops from Afghanistan on September 11th, 2021. Let's broaden this out from CNN, though, Ben. Let's talk about what you've seen as somebody who covers this very closely, covers foreign policy very closely. What have you seen in the last few days in the coverage of President Biden versus the coverage of President Trump?
Yeah, well, of course, the clear sort of foil that the media has tried to create, if you go back to the coverage during the Trump days, was essentially Trump's in over his head. He's just breaking things around the world. He has no concept of the nuances of the intra-Afghanistan tribal rivals and how fighting is seasonal there and all of the other peculiarities around the morass that is Afghanistan. What is lost, of course, in all of the reporting about this is, look, where are the American people on this issue? What is actually in our national interest? Did our leaders ever set clear, tangible goals and objectives? And did they present a plan to achieve them and then leave? Or what exactly is the plan ultimately? Because the plan seems to be in perpetuity, stay there, keep a residual force there. And for what exactly? And also, the whole rationale of, okay, we need to go in and then try to create Switzerland out of Afghanistan, which of course was an insane proposition. How do we weigh the costs and benefits of this tribal land that no one has ever succeeded in sort of controlling, nor should they necessarily want to succeed in doing so? What was the end game exactly? None of these questions or nuances are being addressed, of course, in terms of the Biden coverage. But even more to the point, the fact that we actually had a president who asked basic questions of what are we doing there, who's benefiting from it long term, what's the end game, and then ultimately getting to the question of like, is this sort of a military industrial complex sort of situation rather than a situation that is rooted in what is best for the American people and what the American people want, and especially of our media, which talks about democracy, but they don't seem to care about it in a situation like this, notwithstanding also the fact that the people in our media have no skin in the game for the most part with respect to what's going on in Afghanistan and around the world. And oh, by the way, we have myriad threats that we face. So what is the highest and best use of American blood and treasure around the world? All of these things are just basic questions that journalists should be asking about. They should be probing. They should be talking about the fact that, okay, from the other perspective, let's say you leave and a terrorist force does amass there and it might pose a threat to the homeland. Then what's the plan? If you were taking this from the other side of things. Personally, I was more, I guess when I was younger, looking at the situation, there's a rationale for going in Afghanistan. We achieved our objectives, but then what? And the then what part has been going on for over a decade now. And for what? And again, who benefits? And the media, if they were really reporting on this, honestly, would ask those questions. And then they'd say, okay, President Biden, here are the potential downsides to what you're doing. How do you address those downsides? What are the upsides? How do you plan to redeploy these resources or not? There's basically none of that. It was Trump was incompetent and going against the generals, God forbid, and challenging leaders who have in many instances failed and not provided a clear and compelling rationale for what we're doing overseas. And I say this, by the way, as someone who's an ardent counter-jihadist and believes in having the strongest, most powerful military force that we possibly can, so that you don't have to apply it in nearly every situation or almost any situation for that matter. But in this case, the merits of the situation are never dealt with. And this story is to some extent, barely a blip. Like the Russian bounty story is almost bigger than the Afghanistan story itself. It's kind of remarkable to witness.
Well, one thing I like about Drew's tweet, which I can put up again on here, is how it shows like this way the media is able to change the facts of a story or change public perception of a story so subtly. Like this is months and months and months and months and months apart. And it's a very, like, you can see the contrast, and it's not just CNN, of course. You can see the contrast here, but it is more subtle, right? It's in this way where they're trying to, like, in one point, they bend themselves over backwards to find a way to pass off as objective a very harsh criticism of Donald Trump, whereas when it relates to, and I think my picture's frozen, but you can probably still hear my video, but when it relates to Joe Biden, they will find a way to frame it positively. And at the end of the day, it's because you can frame almost everything positively if you find the right partisan people to quote, if you find the right angle, you can find a way to do that, right? And so I think that's to some extent, a really, really, really obvious illustration of their bias. These juxtaposed CNN stories right here. I'm actually going to put them up again because they are so. It's a great example, and this is on something that is like not. There's bipartisan agreement and disagreement on this issue. And so when you see coverage like that on an issue that does have bipartisan agreement and disagreement on both sides, I think it's just like as unfortunate as it gets, especially on an issue where the lives of people who actually serve our country are on the line, and they can't even get, the war can't even get fair coverage. And you're right, Ben, that people in the media don't have skin in this game for the most part. And that certainly influences the way they cover these wars that we, get into in the last 20 years. But it's just such a good example of how you can find a way to frame something in the media how you want to frame it. And they always choose to frame it in one direction.
Yeah, and just to that point, and it's a great one. How do you frame Biden in the most positive light? The person who the national security establishment itself says has gotten pretty much every national security and foreign policy decision wrong in his life, and yet he claims to be an expert in that area, and he did chair the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But even setting that aside, the partisanship is clear just from the perspective of, look, this was President Trump's desire and policy. And by the way, he was basically broadsided by the generals, which in a past era, I'm sure that the press would have been livid over. They would have said, how could first of all, this president wants to pull troops out of a place, and the generals are stopping him. Like, this is tyranny, this is anarchy, this is authoritarianism. You can imagine how this would have been covered under another president in a war that most people in the press probably 6 years ago, they would have said, yeah, take every last troop out of there. So it shows you that it's not the merits of the substance of the issue. It's the politics of the issue. It's the players involved. And oh, by the way, it's once again the Biden administration continuing the Trump administration's policies, or even getting the fruits of the Trump administration's policies, but Trump administration will get no credit for it, of course.
And, a question that we always get from viewers is whether this is intentional. And a lot of people are absolutely convinced that it is intentional. And, in a case like this, it's so obvious to me that it's actually contrary to what it seems like. It is not intentional. It's because they are so deluded by their ideology that they lose the ability to sort ideology from fact. And that, again, is extremely dangerous when you have nobody who is of a different ideology who can come in and challenge that perception of fact and offer an alternative perspective that challenges and says you're missing this context. Did you see this reporting over here? Did you see what this Republican senator is saying that you probably dismissed as a crazy person or a cynic or an idiot? When you don't have a back and forth and you have a monopoly, just as in the economy, that creates inefficiency and it creates incompetence. And we are now dealing with a grossly incompetent media that has created an alternative reality that perpetuates the power of the ruling class and perpetuates the power of power brokers in Washington, D.C. at a cost to people down the socioeconomic ladder, people of less privilege. And that is just an incredibly sad state of affairs. But I am grateful, Ben, that we have these contrasts as an opportunity to highlight that, because I think the more people understand it, the more the new infrastructure, the new media infrastructure can build and can be supplemented and drive eyeballs away from the staid conventions of a totally broken and corrupted industry.
Yeah, and I think the last word I'd have on it is it's readily apparent for all to see. People talk about being red-pilled over the last 4 years. The media is so blatant and brazen in it that it's becoming clear that we really do have a Pravda-esque media. And in any number of cases I've cited, sort of our media speaking in the exact same tongue as the Chinese Communist Party's English language mouthpieces. It's so blatant and it's so readily apparent. And people are so craving a dissenting opinion that I do think that it does provide a great opportunity to exploit the fact that, as you said, there is this calcified, horrible, horrendous structure that exists out there because they have had no competition. And thankfully for now, we do have some platforms to compete with it. All that said, if we end up in a gulag and if we have to build our own alternative internet, I think all bets are off. But hopefully some courageous politicians will stand up and fight against the tyranny of the big tech oligarchs and their friends in the corporate media.
Well, we could keep going literally for another 2 hours, I think, Ben. But hey, it's happy hour. It's Friday. That's enough good news so that we can, I guess, feel confident ending this edition of bad news. Don't you think?
I think that's the only way to end it. And let's enjoy the fact that we still haven't been censored, but give it a little more time. I guess if we do, actually, that'd be a testament to the fact that you, the viewers out there, are appreciating what you're getting and we're doing our job properly.
Yes. Well, we are here every Wednesday and Friday. We're usually in the mornings around 10:30 Eastern time, but sometimes we're later. So just stay tuned, subscribe to our channels so you know when we're broadcasting. But every Wednesday and Friday, that's what's up. Feel free to shoot us your comments. We read just about all of them and we appreciate the feedback. We are Bad News. We're a project of the Federalist. We're broadcast from the National Journalism Center at Young America's Foundation. We'll see you soon with more. But until then, stay tuned. We'll be back with more bad news in the future.